We'll stick here quickly, and I'll usually say my slides are not always quite so UMass branded, which is where I'm chatting to you all from today, but these were slightly stolen from a different presentation where the branding was asked of me. So hi, everybody. My name is Blake Spitz. I'm an archivist at UMass. And I'm sort of going first as the, I think, slightest twist on a typical activity, the least radical offering, but I think still some ideas for folks who are trying to think of some new ways to incorporate some document analysis, but with some bigger context around it. And that bigger context for me is really thinking about using our analysis in the layout of storytelling and starting with both secondary sources and primary sources. So next slide, please. So the library is featured in both those photos. That's where I'm here from, up on the 25th floor of that tall building, which is the W.E.B. Du Bois Library. And these are the main areas that my department collects, and a big one being social change, driven by our holding of the Du Bois papers, which will be the example that I give for you all today. So next slide, please. So this activity twist is really just thinking about annotating secondary sources with primary sources with the goal of telling complex historical stories. So I start class with an accessible secondary source. This can be anything. It could be a Wikipedia clip. It could be from a textbook. Hopefully it's something that your students will be aware of and know as a secondary source. You could talk about it as something that you would use, that those students would use in their research, right? Or that they would be able to find pretty easily. And that's sort of the framing of the story. Then you're going to distribute related or unrelated or contesting primary sources and analyze those with the purpose of adding to that narrative that you've encountered in the secondary source. And that can be adding with details, context, questions about people's point of view, other things like that. And then you're going to go around the room, either as a collective or in pairs or at tables, however you're framing your activity. This is pretty flexible. And sort of take the secondary source as the scaffolding or the skeleton of that story and give it some meat and bones from your primary source analysis to tell a broader, more complicated, potentially, story as a group during your assignment. So next slide, please. So this is the slide I have up when we do this in class. I often use a heavily excerpted version of a New Yorker article that came out in 2019 about a debate, well, two debates really, that Du Bois conducted with this white supremacist named Lothrop Stoddard. So we have basically the factual pieces of that debate from the New Yorker article that I've excerpted out. And then we hand out a bunch of primary sources. I use 5 tables, generally 2 sources each. And this slide will be up to remind the students of the activity and that they're looking for, all these details, descriptive things or questions that we're going to all add to that story together later as a class. But you can do this with, I think historical figures are pretty easy, taking a Wikipedia piece and adding stories. If you work at a school or a college, or any environment where they have founders or important people or myths that sort of circulate on campus, you can take that myth as your secondary source and then have students really expand that history with some primary sources. So next slide, please. So I will, for people who are extremely interested in my example of this debate story, I will link in my next slide, which will be accessible to folks, has the link to this Padlet, because I did have a version of it that I used during the pandemic, sending students to breakout rooms or doing it entirely asynchronously. So this gives you just a little bit of a sense. We would start with that excerpt from the New Yorker, and then there'd be 5 groups and they would each have different sources. And I'll just give some, a quick example is that students get some information that Du Bois is aware of Stoddard well before the debate. So we get his opinion on this man as some additional context that we can add to our story. We get some information about Du Bois later on after the first debate, going into the second one, how eager he is to participate in this event. We see the sponsors of the debate, which can really impact our opinion about, who's going to be successful, who's being set up to really have their voice disseminated. And we get some post-debate letters to Du Bois as well. And so we get to learn some more about how his audience reacted to this. And it's mostly positive, but there's some interesting questions that come from those letters as well. So if folks really want to dig into this specific example, this will be pretty accessible online with my link at the next slide. So next slide, please. And again, these slides will be shared. These are to my department, to that Padlet that I mentioned, to the original article that's in the New Yorker. It's really interesting. My students don't get to read it in class because we use an excerpt, but I always like to point folks to it. It's a really interesting story. And you also get to learn a lot of the history of Chicago in some ways as well. I have a link to the land acknowledgement from where UMass and the 5 colleges sit on Nanatucket land. And I saw this at a previous conference. I'm going to use my last minute to push the Indian Land Tenure Foundations beyond Land Acknowledgement Fund. Financial means are not the ways that everyone can connect to the land in their area or learn more about those, but it is a way for some folks to engage and to sort of get beyond the land acknowledgement. So this is a way to contribute financially to this cause. So I'll leave that link as well. And I've been trying to spread it in professional environments because I think it's an interesting and helpful place as well to continue sort of to engage with some of those questions. So yeah, that's it for me. And I'm going to pass it on to Sarah.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Blake, for your very, very cool presentation. My name is Sarah Andrus. I am the librarian at the Henry Ford Benson Ford Research Center, and I'm going to talk to you a bit today about teaching with mail order catalogs. Go to the next slide. Before I get really into the depth of the kind of teaching activity, I wanted to give a brief intro to who we are, since we're not in a traditional university setting. So that I work at the Benson Ford Research Center. It is one of the 5 venues at the Henry Ford. Our better known venues are the Henry Ford Museum of American Innovation and Greenfield Village, or you might have seen us on the Henry Ford's Innovation Nation with Mo Rocca on CBS on Saturday mornings. We're located in Dearborn, Michigan. Right now, our research center is answering about 2,000 remote research requests a year, and we are still closed to the public for staffing related issues that still stem from the 2020 COVID everything we're all dealing with. And I only bring this up to say that we are working with 6 people instead of the 20 we were before, and we're still able to do activities like this. We have roughly 3,000 archival collections, and we do have robust trade and mail order catalog collections as well. And we can go to our next slide. So one of the things that we do is offer instruction, and this is because we have a charter school on our campus. It's a unique charter school. I believe they've done several others in a similar model on cultural institution campuses with buy-ins from those institutions, corporate partners, and local community educational institutes. So the Henry Ford Academy is ours. And I should also say Ford Motor Company helps fund some things, but we are all our own independent institutions. We are not just a Ford thing. So the Henry Ford Academy is just high school. They utilize the Benson Ford Research Center for instruction. And without any media center or library, I work closely with their teachers to work on information literacy, research methodologies, and now working with primary sources is something we've gotten really into in the last few years. We can go to the next slide where I will actually talk about the activity. So over the last 5 or so years, myself and the social studies curriculum chair and teacher extraordinaire, Jeff Kozlowski, and I have been working to develop this activity, and it's kind of reached its final form in the last few years with his classes. Jeff calls it fitting in, as in this photo that I've taken from him, and I call it building a life. It's more of a hands-on activity that showcases a primary store students and researchers alike tend to overlook: mail order catalogs. The activity itself is pretty simple, but it does require a little background work. Each student randomly selects a profession and a salary out of a hat. Examples have included painters, bankers, baseball players, secretaries, and even ballroom dancers. These are created in advance and reflect the era of the catalogs that are going to be used. We regularly target the session to focus on the 1930s because the Benson Ford Research Center does have very robust Sears and Roebuck catalogs, as well as Montgomery Ward's catalogs from that era. And these classes are usually about 30 students deep. So we really do need robust collections to facilitate them all having their own catalog to work with. So we do that. We put together the profession and the salary information, and that takes a little bit of time. But once we've done it, we use pretty much the same information for the last 5 years. That doesn't change. It's static historic information that you're able to pull up fairly quickly. So we're still using that same pieces of paper in the same hat. So after they've randomly selected, each student sits down in front of a catalog. And then they begin a process of putting together a wardrobe, building things that they would need to kind of live their life. Everything from undergarments to socks, shoes, hats, parasols, glasses. We always get one student that asks if they can buy a very large diamond. We always tell them we are not their financial literacy course. So they're kind of figuring these things out. And then we're trying to get them to figure out, how far does your salary go? What really is happening when you buy these things? What other things might you not have? There aren't a ton of non-perishables or of course fresh food in these catalogs. So we're kind of putting all of that to the side and saying, okay, where does your salary go with just these things? And once they get through the wardrobe, we can then have them furnish a house. So it is teaching them a bit about what things cost, what things would be prioritized, and what things exist in this certain time. And it's always a little interesting to see them interact with inflation and things like that. We then encourage the students to discuss their findings as they work and to ask questions of myself and any other research center staff that we have available that day. We found that the students learn a lot about a period by seeing what was popular during that time frame. And our students aren't usually aware of how things like mail order catalogs used to work. I mean, they're not selecting their back to school wardrobes or anything or holiday gifts from catalogs anymore, but they do know how website wish lists work. They do know things like that. So we're able to talk about distribution methods and what it would mean if you lived in a small town and this was the only way you could get things, how tailoring worked. You're able to discuss trends and you're able to talk about material history, which is not something that they might think of as a forefront or something that they could be studying. We're also lucky to be working out of a museum. The school is based in our museum and in our historic operating village. Their classrooms are truly a part of our campus. So we're able to say, hey, look at this. Now look at our labels in our museum, or look at another cultural institution when you go and look at artifacts. Very often, some of these catalogs can be used for this type of research, and that's where people are pulling information. That's where we're verifying dates and objects and creators and things like that. And it opens their eyes to a different type of primary source research. And I always kind of like to end with, I found my great-grandmother's engagement ring that I wear all the time in one of these catalogs, so that they were being used by people and you can see proof of life through these. And I have one more slide that we can go to. And this is just an example of one of the catalogs that we use regularly. It's a Sears and Roe book from 31. It's a summer catalog. Not all of the pictures are in color. Obviously, there's a lot of very tiny black and white, but a lot of the fashion pages do have color. They can see how things would actually look. They can follow trends for children, for women's fashion, and for men's fashion is usually how it's broken down. But obviously Sears is known as the kind of buy anything store at this point. So this is a page of where you could buy all of your bathroom fixtures, or if I'm not mistaken, a full bathroom. We also talk about the Sears house, kind of the, if you want anything, you can get it from Sears model with our students. And I believe I have one slide left. This is just my contact information. And I believe all of our slides are being shared. I'm always happy to answer questions, and I will pass it on to Miranda.
Hi, everyone. My name is Miranda Rectenwald. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the curator of local history, which is part of the Department of Special Collections at Washington University in St. Louis. We are a fairly large department, but the activity that I'm going to describe is something that I created on my own. I do want to preface this by saying this is not an activity that I do with all of my classes. It's more in depth, but I have found it useful, so I thought I would share it with you. But I do want to preface that this is not something I do for all of my classes. The goal of the activity that I came up with was to look at, to help a group of students look at some very conflicting, challenging history. This was designed for upper class high school students, so it would also be appropriate for college students or adult learners. And it was designed specifically for a program called Cultural Leadership, which are selected high school students who are interested in learning cultural leadership skills about culture and sensitivity to, with the eye towards them being the leaders of the future towards conflict resolution, tackling difficult subjects. So I was asked to present something with this group of students, and there was going to be about 35 students. And then we discovered that we were going to need to do it initially outdoors because this was in 2021. And there was some pandemic concerns still, so we couldn't use original objects. So that was sort of the genesis of this activity. It was something that would be done with replica items, but still focused on primary sources. I also had the goal of increasing use of a very large collection, which is one of many eclectic collections I oversee, which is the ACLU of Missouri records. This is a several hundred box collection. It's very legal focused. It's very dense topically and often without context. So it is not as used as often as I would like. So those are sort of my goals and also the goals of the program. So the skills we focused on were evaluating evidence, thinking about difficult issues, and also, much like Blake's discussion, considering multiple viewpoints of a topic. The format we did was introducing the topic to the whole class, and then they did small group work, but that could be adapted. And we used all reproduction of documents that I selected from the archives, with some handwritten things having text transcriptions also, since these were high school students. Next slide, please. So what the activity was were case packets. They each got a topic, and these topics were all difficult questions. So the example here is, was the KKK able to adopt a highway and pick up litter in Missouri? The other activities we did were, in 1977, was the local chapter of the Nazis able to have a march in St. Louis? What happened when there was a police interaction between a teenager outside his home? And also a controversy over could a school newspaper that was dealing with topics of birth control and teen pregnancy, could that be censored? So these were not light topics. And so to do the activity, I created very brief summaries that were attempted to be just sort of factual summaries, and then select primary sources. So here you can see they have kind of read about this, the topic, and then they're prompted to read the copy of the letter. And they're each given like a packet, literally, with the documents in it. Then they discuss what they think happened. And once each group had kind of had a discussion about what they thought happened, then they open a second packet that I give them that is their results, which is actually what happened in history, and sometimes some more additional primary sources. And then they have a second discussion of, is that outcome what they expected? Did the people react how they were sort of extrapolating them to react? Why or why not? And so that is the framing for it. Next slide, please. This is an example of the results packet. All of the documents that they're given, I added, citation information, that this was a copy from the archive, and then they also got a list of the sources, because we did have a limited time, but the students were possibly interested in exploring the topic further afterwards. And it has gone really well. I will also add, this is not a collection that I have anything digitized of. So literally, in order to create this activity, I took photos of the documents I wanted to use, or occasionally stuck that specific document on a scanner. So it's not a collection where I had digitized materials to pull from. Some of these are just cell phone photos that I took and then reproduced. Next slide, please. So just in general, I do want to point out that this activity was highly focused about archives in general. So I do talk to the students at the first about how these are documents from the archive. These are things that I looked through and selected for the activity, but we don't go into anything about using an archive. That was not a goal of this activity. Oh, the packet lists the sources with all the citations. Everything says it's a copy from, so I make it very clear to them that these things that they're handling, that these are multiple copies. And just to kind of think about the pros and the cons, it did take a long time to prepare this. That was a bit of a downside because I had to kind of revise it. And the first year I did this, a couple of the documents didn't work so well, so I swapped them out for a few others. But the pro was that it was definitely reusable. I have done this for 3 years now. And after the first year, the amount of work I had to do was just printing things. It is portable, so I have taken this to their class, which has been in various places. It has been expandable, so the number of students they have has gone up, so I've been able to easily expand it to having more students involved. And I feel like it is adaptable. For the high school students, I had one topic, so the most difficult topic we tackled was was there a Nazi march in 1977? And that we did as a mass group, like all 35 of us talking it through so that they had an understanding of like, okay, we're going to really analyze this. We're going to think about who were the people involved and we're going to go through all this together. And then I gave them another case that they did in a smaller group kind of on their own with still some adult support. If I did this with college students, I probably would not be so modeling and scaffolding. But that was my activity, and I will pass it to Megan.
All right. Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. I'm Megan Atkinson, and I am the archivist at Tennessee Tech University, which is in Middle Tennessee. And I'm going to real brief run through 3 projects that I do. I put my information in the chat in case you want to add more, and they're also included on the Padlet. But I just want to talk about 3 projects. And first one is the big paper project, and it's very minimal. It's very easy. I will say it did come from Kate Hutchins at the University of Michigan Special Collections, and I've kind of revamped it a bit for myself. But all it is writing a question that pertains to something you're interested in the students exploring on 2 large pieces of paper, or 4, depending on how large your class is. Splitting the classroom into groups and having them answer these questions. And then what the groups would then do is swap the pieces of paper, and then the second group will be able to answers a question the other group did. And then and it goes back and forth that way. The one thing that I really like about this project is because you can see it requires pieces of paper and markers. And then if you want to bring a primary source for them to answer a question about, you can too, but it's a minimal amount of material. You can kind of do it at last minute. And if you are a person that travels to different classes and stuff like that, you don't have to carry a whole lot of material with you, and it requires minimal amount of prep. But some of the things that I've tried is I've worked with students and asked what is an archivist, what are archives, and the types of responses that you get are very involved. And if the one student, when the one group passes it to the next group, they really have to play off even wider details. So I find that students are really able to contemplate something that they haven't been able to think about in such a deep way. And at the end, we kind of discuss it. I elaborate on some of the things that they've talked about. I never say they're wrong. I just kind of, since sometimes they're just working on their own perceptions, especially in the case of the primary sources, or even in what an archivist is. And it usually lasts about an hour. So it's a pretty quick project, but I do find that they get very involved in what they're doing. The second photo assignment, this is the normal now and then photograph that you see, and that people share a lot. And in this particular case, you need a nice day. And what I do is I give students copies of historic buildings on the campus, and you could do this locally, if you're in a town or if you're in a community. The most important part to remember, and what I did was I did have these photographs and I established them based on distance. And you also have to let whoever you're working with know ahead of time, whether maybe they don't have the ability, or if it's a really hot day, someone might not want to be out. And I set the photographs up based on the furthest from where we are to the closest to where we are. And I also make sure that I provide current maps of the campus for those maybe that are a little less familiar. And the students go out and they take pictures based on the historic image I gave them in the same exact way. The students have a lot of fun with this. I've had them pose people in the same way that people were posed in the photographs. And when they come back, I have them look at the sources available to identify and date the picture that they have. And they write a brief description on the photo about, and you need to set up parameters for what you're looking for from the students before they start looking at the secondary sources or the primary sources, such as we usually use yearbooks, or we'll use our catalogs. And students will date the photographs. They'll come up with information regarding what was in the building. And this information was then all taken and put in an Omeka exhibit, which I did post the link to. But at the same time, you can also do something as simple as putting it on social media instead of creating an entire exhibit. Students love going out and for a walk, especially after a semester long of sitting inside, and it was a nice day. And they also really enjoyed looking at yearbooks, as they usually always do. This was a class period that was about an hour and a half. Prep time after you get it done once is usually pretty quick afterwards. And I learned yesterday about place-based education, and I really do feel like that fit in there. It really taught students about where they were on campus, and it gave them some ideas about the campus community and how it's changed over time. And the third assignment I have here is just an accession assignment. And I will say that preface that these are archives class students. I do an undergraduate class. And basically, beginning of the class, we talk about values, intrinsic, informational. We also talk about collection policies and why you would take something and not take something in. And this one involves a little bit more class period time, because obviously you have to teach about these things, but also I pull a small collections folder that we have for each one of the students. And what they do is they go through this worksheet. It asks them what would make the item valuable? Can we care for it? Under what circumstances would it be kept? And this provides for really good discussion. It does let students learn about the decision-making process that we have in archival collections and the reason that some things are valuable. And this is one of those class periods that I also get to pull out so many things that do have like that intrinsic value, like signed books or the oldest document, and things that students usually always want to know, like they always want to know what's the oldest thing you have and stuff like that. So we're able to pull those things out and show those to the students. So, and I am the end presenter, and I think I mentioned I put this on the Padlet too. So